Welcome to this edition of Group Talk, a Java Jumpstart, Eating the Elephant. You'll be hearing from Paul Calhoun, the Director of Worldwide Enablement here at GBS. Without further ado, here's Paul.
Officially good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our worldwide audience. I'm glad y'all were able to join us this morning, this afternoon, this evening for this session. This is a modified version of the session that I presented at Lotusphere this year. That was a jumpstart that we did twice, and it was pretty well attended, so I think there's a lot of interest still in the community for Domino developers and moving over into the Java space. So without further ado, we're going to kind of jump right into the presentation. It's going to be a combination of slides and then live demo of code. So again, that's just who I am, what I do. For the past 20-odd years, I've been working with Notes Domino. I've been working with Notes Domino since release 2. For the last year, I've been working with GBS as the Director of Worldwide Enablement, primarily working on bringing Domino developers to Java, to XPages, and working with some of our tools. The agenda for today is as follows. We're going to go through the roadmap. One of the things that I have found a lot over the past 15 years in training Domino developers on how to code in Java is that there's a lot of false starts. I would poll anywhere from 10 to 1,000 developers and ask them how many of them had tried to start learning Java, and invariably everyone raised their hand, and they raised their hand and said, I tried, I started, I couldn't get anywhere with it. So we want to provide a roadmap or a foundation for you to be successful in your Java journey and going down through that. We're going to go over the Java language fundamentals. I will warn you that you are not going to leave this 2-hour session a complete Java guru, but you will have definitely the language fundamentals that you need in order to start writing your first Java code inside of Domino Designer. We'll get in and take a look at Domino Designer 8.5x. Pretty much everything that I demonstrate will be from 8.5.3, but all of the code, with the exception of the Java code elements that I demonstrate, are going to work in 8.5.0, 8.5.1, 8.5.2. If you don't have 8.5 yet, all of the agent code is going to work fine in previous releases as well. We'll get in and talk about developing Java code in Lotus Domino specifically, look at some of the Domino objects, some of the things that you can do, kind of do a wrap-up. And as Don mentioned, if you have questions, please go ahead and put those into the question section, and we'll get to those questions at the end as soon as we get there. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Learning Java, I've always said, is a lot like eating an elephant. It's a huge job, and you don't really have any clear place where to start. As a Domino developer, regardless of how you arrived at the Domino development scene, a lot of us didn't come to Domino with any quote-unquote formal programming background. So therefore, when we go and we try to attack a new language, then it's really difficult to try to figure out where to start. And given the depth and breadth of what Java is, it makes that job just that much harder. So we want to go in and provide that foundation and that roadmap one byte at a time. So this is where you're going to start, this is where you go. One of the biggest mistakes a lot of people make is trying to jump into the Servlets, JSPs, and JSFs interface. They learn that XPages are built on top of Java Server Pages and Java Server Faces, and they dive kind of right in the middle of that. And unfortunately, what that does is start your journey kind of halfway through without really understanding where you came from. So it's really, really important that you start with the Java 2 Standard Edition, which is the J2SE. There's some really, really great resources out there that are available for that. One of the things that you want to make sure that you have completely done is immersed yourself in the core foundation of the syntax, data types, constructs. What are the core classes? Java.lang, Java.io, Java.net. If you've learned all the classes that are the Lotusscript classes, then learning the classes that are the Java ones are just as easy. So again, it's just another language, it's another tool in your toolbox. We'll talk about that. I get asked a lot, what is the learning curve for this? And what I would ask you to do if you've been working with Notes and Domino for any amount of time is, if you didn't have any background in BASIC prior to going and learning Lotusscript, how long did that take you? Because it's going to take about the same amount of time for you to go in and learn the core foundation that is J2SE. And I tell developers to take 3 to 6 months to do that, and that's kind of assuming that you have a day job, in that you've got to go in and produce things on a daily basis. So you're actually kind of learning Java on the job, or maybe after hours. But it's important that you get in and you apply something to it every day. I've given you the following URL, and again, these slides will be made available to you at the end of the presentation. But that's a good place to start. I've also got a screenshot of the Head First Java book. It's currently in its second edition, and I can tell you that this is just a great resource. One of the reasons that I recommend this particular book is the way that it presents the Java material. It does present it in a way that is kind of lighthearted, but then allows you to actually grasp those concepts, those foundations, and then be able to apply them. So I've been actually facilitated the Head First Java as a curriculum or training, and I've been able to do that using Domino Designer. So you can actually take the examples, pull them into Domino Designer, and use that as your development tool. So if you're not familiar with the Head First series, they have an entire series, and I'll show you some other ones. But absolutely, the Head First Java book I can't really recommend enough. Once you've got the core J2SE down, then one of the things that I would recommend is then learning XML. It's not part of the Sun certification, and it doesn't really have much to do with Java at all, except for the fact that a lot of the configuration files that we get into, a lot of the data streams that we use, specifically with SOAP and web services, that's XML syntax. And I find that a lot of Domino developers who haven't kind of jumped on the Java bandwagon also haven't really jumped on the XML bandwagon. XML syntax, DDD, schemas, XSL. I put this other one in. I've been kind of doing some polling of developers at the XPages boot camps that we've done worldwide, and I've seen a couple of articles out in the the blog sphere about JSON kind of edging XML out as the kind of ubiquitous data transfer mechanism of choice. So I will be real honest that I haven't really fully embraced JSON yet. I find JSON syntax a little bit more cryptic and a little bit more harder to manage than XML, and that has primarily to do with my comfort zone with XML. So that's definitely something that is currently on my roadmap to become more familiar with. I'm finding that a lot more tool sets, a lot more APIs, especially if you get into XPages and start working with Dojo, that a lot of those APIs are predicated on data formatted in the JSON format. So absolutely, that should be something that if it's not on your radar, it should be on your radar as well. If you want to go ahead and extend your Java knowledge beyond Notes and Domino, beyond XPages, then you should probably familiarize yourself with Servlets and JSPs. And there's an excellent book, again, from Head First called Head First Servlets and JSPs. I believe that's also in its second edition. If you want to kind of understand, kind of take a step backwards, there's also the Head First design patterns. And that is written from a Java point of view or a Java perspective. And that's also an excellent book if you want to become more familiar with object-oriented programming techniques. There's also a Head First book called Object-Oriented Programming and Design. So there, if you just take those three books and go through those at your leisure, again, it's going to give you a great head start. But I cannot emphasize enough that you want to spend a lot of time inside learning the core and then move on to the higher level Java APIs like Servlets, Java Server Pages, Java Server Faces. So a lot of Domino developers who find out that XPages are built on top of JSFs like try to jump straight into the JSF API, and that's really their first taste of Java. And it's overwhelming, and it's not something that we recommend that folks do. So take one step backwards, invest the time in learning J2SE, and then I guarantee that a lot of this other stuff is going to come a lot easier. It takes another 3 to 6 months to kind of get your head around these things, only because you don't really write JSPs and JSFs, and you can write servlets in Domino, but for the most part, XPages has abstracted the developer from really getting into the core nuts and bolts of JSP and JSF. So going through one of those books, unless you have something like the Tomcat server to play with, or you have an IBM WebSphere server, then that might be something, again, that you don't have something to apply to right away. But definitely something that should be on your roadmap. Kind of summing this up. I can't really emphasize enough that you need to start small. So you want to write Java agents. So y'all have been writing formula code and Lotusphere agent for years and years and years. So now you just need to get into the habit of when it's time to edit an agent or it's time to write a new agent that you look at doing that in the Java language instead. Create Java classes that you can use as libraries. Those are the same as your Lotusphere libraries. Use those in agents and XPages. New to 8.5.3 is a really, really cool new code element called the Java code element. And that simply makes including Java code in XPages significantly easier because any of the classes that you create through that Java code element are automatically included in the Java class path. And we'll talk about what that is in a little bit. But definitely if you're working with 8.5.3, it's definitely one of the reasons to step up to 8.5.3 if you haven't done so already. And then graduate to servlets. I will tell you that now that we have XPages, that including servlets in your toolbox is not as big a deal as it used to. Prior to 8.5 with XPages availability, I used to write a lot of servlets. We did a lot of things through the Servlet API, predominantly because the execution model of servlets versus agents. Servlets actually run in memory, they stay memory resident, unlike the agent execution model where agents are loaded into memory, executed, and then taken out of memory. Then along came XPages, and now XPages actually, when they're finished compiling, they also actually execute as servlets. So again, this is not as critical in 8.5x as it used to be, although it's not a bad idea to really kind of understand the servlet execution model and what's going on there. Roadblocks. What's going to keep you from being successful? One of the things that we find is kind of linear thinking. With no disrespect to a developer that I have a lot of respect for, which is Mr. Bill Buchan. He did a lot of great work around using Lotusphere as an object-oriented programming language. But at the end of the day, Lotusphere is still interpreted. So no matter how how much lipstick you put on that particular pig, it's not ever going to be object-oriented. So moving back away from thinking about code line 1 through code line 12 and really starting more to think in objects. And the object-oriented programming book and the Introduction to Java book, those will all help you do that. Trying to learn Java with J2EE applications like servlets and JSPs. If you have developers that jump into the pool kind of in the deep end, they don't have that foundation where they've learned the core strokes of what Java is. If you try to start with the Java Enterprise Technologies, again, bad. Try to learn Java in conjunction with a huge mission-critical project. I've seen several of these flame out and burn really, really bad in that you're starting a new development project and you decided, okay, this new CRM application we're going to build, we're going to code it all in Java, although we don't know Java. So we're going to learn Java and we're going to build the CRM product as we go. And it's just doomed to fail. I have never seen any of those types of projects be successful. So it's really important that you go back. You start small. The one thing that I can say to you that is of the utmost importance is you've got to apply it every day. I don't care what kind of Java code. I don't care if you just get in and modify Hello World every day and change it from Hello World to Hello Paul or Hello whoever. But get in and play with the Java API, storing and saving code, executing code. Do something with it every day. It's just like anything else that you're trying to learn, in that if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. And that's what's happened to a lot of Domino developers who actually kind of jumped on the Java bandwagon, and they did a pretty good job of learning the core Java structures. But when it came to crunch time, they didn't really use the Java pieces. They kind of fell back to using what they knew best, which is Lotusphere. So again, get in and do something with it every day. Again, I don't really care how big or how small, if it's production ready or if it's just your own little playground. But get in and play with it. You have thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of Lotusphere that are back-end agents that you can use as kind of templates for you to go in and do that. So one of my favorite sayings is the only tool you have is a hammer, then you tend to see every problem as a nail. And simply what that speaks to is the fact that you have a toolbox. And right now the tools in your toolbox are predominantly the formula language and Lotusscript. And we're not saying, I've never said, that you should never ever write another line of Lotusscript, because that's just foolish. Lotusscript is a tool in your toolbox, and it certainly has its place for doing development depending upon what the outcome of that development should be. So therefore, all I want to do is add an additional tool to your toolbox, and that's Java. We want to put Java as a tool in your toolbox, so when you're scoping a project, then you have a complete range of tools to work from. If you've not ever done anything with Java, when you scoped a project, then Java wasn't even on the table, even though it might have been the best tool for the job, because that skill set didn't exist with you or with your department. So absolutely, this is the primary focus here, is not going in and saying, you know, from this point forward it will be Java or nothing. It's saying from this point forward, Java is now a tool in my toolbox, which means that it is an option for me when I go out and start working with stuff. I get asked a lot. I've been asked for the past 15 years. It's kind of funny. That, you know, as Domino developers, we hear all the time, well, Lotusscript, you know, is dead. They're not going to write any more Lotusscript. They're going to phase Lotusscript out. Well, Java has been around for a long time as well, and it kind of suffers from that same thing. This is actually the TOB index from February 2012, and you'll see that Java is on top, and it's been on top. It says since 2002, which is the past 10 years, but it's actually, you know, because that's, you know, all the data that it's showing. But it's actually been on top, you know, for the past 15 years since they really started doing the index. It has been the #1 programming language. It was usurped for a small amount of time by C, but then, you know, again, it was just a very small amount, and, you know, definitely for the past 7 years or so, it is predominantly the #1 programming language of the inner tubes today. So if you're looking to find out whether or not people are writing Java code still, absolutely, and the TOB index is one of those places where you can go and you can kind of have that validated. So it's out there, it's being used, then you need to use it. So Java language fundamentals. Let's just kind of take you through a little historical perspective here. It was developed by Sun Microsystems. James Gosling has been in the news lately, but he's, you know, the father of Java. It was intended for consumer electronics, never really kind of took off there, gained popularity in '95. Oracle acquired Sun in April of 2009. So a lot of references that you see to Sun Java is now actually the Oracle Java. It was designed and meant for portability. It was meant to be, you know, kind of small, concise, so that you could write once, run anywhere. That's kind of Java's claim to fame, is that any of the code that you develop can execute on any platform. The caveat there is it's going to execute on any platform with a Java virtual machine, so any hardware architecture that's implemented a JVM. And that's kind of the platform-specific version or runtime for Java code. But you can write Java code that you can feel confident is going to execute in any Java virtual machine on any hardware platform, you know, given that it's compiled to the same compatibility level. We'll talk more a little bit about that. Java source code is stored in plain text, so you can write Java with Notepad. So if you have Notepad in the Java compiler, that used to be the kind of claim to fame. If you had never actually compiled a Java program at the command line, and this was long before the days of integrated development environments like Eclipse, then, you know, you weren't a real programmer. Today, I would say that other than, you know, an exercise in nostalgia, that you don't want to compile things at the command line. You definitely want to get you an integrated development environment. We'll talk more about that as well. The Java code lifecycle, regardless of the tool that you're using, whether you're writing it up all in Notepad and compiling it at the command line, or you've got Eclipse or Java Beans or NetBeans, then you always write Java code, which is a text file, and that's a plain text file that is human readable, developer readable. That is actually then taken through a compiler, and it's compiled into the actual bytecode that's going to be executed by the JVM, and that's what is actually implemented at production time. So the Java source code is on the developer box. You compile that through whatever means, either the command line or through the IDE. If you're using Domino Designer, then Any of the Java code you create gets automatically compiled when you save it and stored as an attachment to, for example, the agent or the web service. And then it actually executes in the platform-specific Java virtual machine. And this is what allows you to write code that's going to execute on Windows, Linux, Macs, AIX boxes, etc. The lifecycle never changes. If you're a C developer, if you come to Java through the C programming stream, then one of the things in C that we had to do a lot of the times was actually keep track of our pointer, and we had to do our own memory management, which just added an additional layer of complexity. Java removed that, and it does have automatic memory management. It has automatic garbage collection. That's built into the language, so you don't have to worry about doing any of that. You can force it programmatically, but again, not a lot of reason to do that. Freeze memories from objects, and we'll talk about the heap size and the stack size when we get into these things. It is definitely designed for distributed systems. Unlike a lot of APIs that were around before the inner tubes became popular, Java was actually developed with networking support baked right into it. So therefore, TCP/IP support HTTP, full range of all the IP sockets, higher level of networking through remote method invocation. Corba can be used with Java. That's actually how we gain access to the back end. But the thing to remember is that the networking portions of Java were glommed on as an afterthought. They were really, really baked into the core product. So if I'm looking at an application and I'm looking at the scope of an application and it says anything about make a connection to system X, then I know that the tools to do that are built into Java, and they're probably a lot more robust than any of the other tools in my toolbox. So certainly that is one of the primary reasons to start investigating including Java, is if you have to connect to any type of external system, whatever that might be. Identifiers are simply the way that we go in and set up, if you will, the keywords for classes, interface methods, variables, parameters. They can contain letters, digits, underscores. The first character can't be a digit. It can be a letter, an underscore, or a $sign. Literals, true, false, and null cannot be used. Reserved words can't be used. And this was a single bullet line before, but I was accused of not pointing it out with enough emphasis. So hopefully I've corrected that here. It is case sensitive. I get asked a lot is, when is Java not going to be case sensitive? And I can pretty much tell you that, no, it's always going to be case sensitive. So be aware that if you're going to start writing that, that's kind of one of the barriers to entry between Java and your existing Lotus script. So once you have your statements, then the next thing we kind of jump into is expressions. Statements are the basic Java expressions. Everything is terminated with a semicolon. If you've been doing stuff with XPages and you haven't been terminating your code with a semicolon, that's a bad thing. JavaScript will let you get away with it. Java will not. The semicolon at the end of the statement is required, so you have to put that in. So we see a simple code output here of variable declarations, duck and ints. Those are the data types. The variable assignments, we use the equal sign for that. We'll take a look at that. Object creation, creating an instance of a new class or instantiating a new object of that class type. And then sending a message is simply passing values, properties, or fields, if you will, to that instantiated instance of the class. Comments. When I first started learning programming, one of my mentors and the people that were kind of teaching me coding and programming drilled into our heads that you leave comments in your code, you put comments in your code for the people who come along behind you. And I know that it's not right, but I will have to confess to you that that was never a huge incentive for me. that putting comments in my code for the people who came along behind me, no, sorry. Look, I spent hours and hours trying to figure out how this works. You can spend hours and hours trying to figure out how it works too, because I don't have time to code and put in comments. And I kept that really, really bad attitude until I was the person who came along behind me. I wrote some code and I put it in production and it just worked. And about 6 months later, they said, we need to make this minor change. I said, yeah, no problem. I open the code up, I take a look at it. I look at it some more, and I said, this is some really cool stuff. I wish I knew what it did. And it took me about 8 hours longer to make that simple code change, where if I'd have dropped in literally maybe a dozen comments, that I would have been able to walk myself through the code that I wrote. And that's just kind of how things work today. So I don't know that I've changed my mind a lot, but definitely I comment my my code maybe too much. It doesn't cost anything in Java to add additional comments. You can actually put in java.comments to generate the Java doc, multi-line comments, and then single-line comments. But especially when you first get started, just get in the habit. Write a line of code, put a comment. Write a line of code, put a comment. And that'll help you understand what's going on, and then also definitely benefit you, and then karma, it'll just benefit the people who come along behind you, which again is not a bad thing. We then have literals, represented hard-coded values. Those are not going to change. Typical string literals, so string 1 equals 1, string 2 equals 2. I can actually instantiate a new instance at the same time. I can say string 1 is equals new string and then pass in the value. Variables can also be created on a single line. So I can say string 1, 2, and 3, which is going to create 3 string objects, and then I can populate those later in the code. But those are your literals. Java is a strongly typed language. There is no variant, and that's a good thing. That's a really, really good thing. If you come to Java from Lotusphere and you were in the habit of using variants a lot, then let me just remind you that every time you use a variant data type in Lotusphere, a kitten passes away, and that's bad. No one wants to hurt kittens. So in Java, you can't do that. So it kind of forces you to type your objects. And we have 2 different types in Java. You've got the primitive data type and the reference data type. So the primitive data types are going to be your ints, your longs, your booleans, and the reference type are going to be wrapper classes for those particular things. So primitives represent that simple data in Java. They're not objects. You can't really send a message. In other words, the primitives don't have methods that accept messages. So therefore, they're raw data types, and they can only contain the type of data that they're set to. Now, in order to actually then manipulate those, typically most all of the simple raw data type or primitives have a wrapper class. So, for example, lowercase double has the uppercase double. Int has integer. Lowercase boolean has boolean, which is a wrapper class. They're denoted, denoted by those capital letters. So I can say int I equals 1, which is, again, the primitive, and then I can instantiate an instance of the integer wrapper class and then pass that value in. And then I can actually then operate on the instance of the integer class. For example, I could get the double value from it, but I could call any of those particular methods. And again, that's kind of a cool thing. Here's just a reference table for you of the different primitives: boolean, byte, short, char, int, float, double, and long. You don't want to, the best practice is not to create a variable larger than what you need. In other words, you don't want to go in and create a double when a float will do. You don't want to create a float when an int will do, etc. Or a short. So just kind of get in and be aware of that. That each of these do take up memory, so you want to make sure that you type your variables the proper way. If you want to then manipulate those numeric types, we do have the notion that lesser types can be promoted to the greater type. So I can say or perform operations like 12 plus 24.56, which is an int plus a long, and what that's going to, or an int plus a double, and then that will actually result in a double because the int will basically be cast up to a double before the operation is performed, and again, it will return a double value. What you can't do is say something like int I is equal to 12, double D is equal to 23.4, and then I is equal to D, because the int variable tile, that's going to actually result in a compiler, a type mismatch. You can't compare those two things, or work with those two things. And this is where typecasting comes along, and it's more for any object, not just numbers, but we tend to do it a lot with numeric values. Values of greater precision can be assigned to variables declared in that lower precision. So a lot of times we'll do typecasting. If you do typecasting from a larger or greater to a lesser, then you need to know that in this particular example, for example, int I is 35 or 34.5. Int I is equal to int 34.5. That first line won't work. That'll throw a type mismatch. This will work, but it'll actually truncate it to the integer value. So you're going to lose that 0.5 precision. So it's not that it can't be done. You just need to be aware of the side effects of doing that when you're casting from a greater to a lesser, if you're doing a lot of mathematical operations there. We also have reference types that are class or interface, and these are typically the object types when we talk about instantiating an instance of a particular object. So any instance of that class can be assigned to it. And this is where the hierarchical polymorphism kind of comes in. You can actually, any instance of any subclass of that class can also be assigned to it. So that's when you get into the true object-oriented nature of Java, where you can instantiate an instance or cast a class to any of its subclasses. Okay? If a variable is declared as a type of interface, and an instance of any class that implements the interface can be assigned to it. So we're not going to dive too far into that, but just kind of give you the high-level overview of this. Reference type names are uniquely identified by the package name that they go into. And a package is simply uniquely identifying the particular object type. The best example of this would be if you're working with the Notes Domino classes, and as well as working with the XML parsing packages, most specifically the DOM. In the W3C DOM package structure, there is a document class. And obviously in the Lotus Domino package, there's also a document class. So in order to differentiate between those two document classes in the same code stream, that's where packages come into play. And so you can fully qualify an object by including its package reference there. And again, we'll get into more examples of that. We have object operators, for example, instance of, not equal to, that's bang equals. Identical is the double equal. If you're going to do comparison operations, we'll look at those. And equals is the assignment operator. To create objects in Java, they're created using constructors. And a class, pretty much every class has a constructor. If the class definition itself does not have a constructor, it uses the default constructor. And this is the term that we use instantiating an instance of an object. So for example, duck, first duck is equal to new duck. We're actually creating a new object called first duck from the duck base class. So this would be the same thing as saying, document doc equals new db get first document. So that's a method that returns a document object. So same thing here. You can pass in values to the constructor. So depending upon the constructor methods, you may be able to pass in field references or messages to the instantiation constructor for that particular object type. And we'll take a look at some examples of that. Assigning an object to a variable is going to bind that variable to the object. So therefore, if I say duck, my duck is equal to new duck 4, then I have duck with a value, whatever the type is, and we'll look at that in just a little bit, of 4. My duck equals new duck 4, my duck 1, my duck 2. I have two separate objects. I can say my duck is equal, 1 is equal to my duck 2 because they're actually derived from the same base class. So I can have those two memory pointers, and now that's only one object in memory versus two objects in memory. We'll talk about equality and assignment here. Operand equals equals used for checking if two objects are identical, and this brings a lot of confusion to folks that are a little bit new to Java as far as the values that get returned. Objects are identical if they occupy the same memory space. If I say int x is equal to 3 and int y is equal to 3, they're actually pointing to the same memory space. So if I say x equals y, then that's going to return true. If I do that, that's with obviously a primitive, but I can then also do that with a class reference. So if I say myDuck1 equals newDuck, by virtue of using the new keyword, that's going to create its own instance. myDuck2 equals newDuck4, that's going to return false because those two things are not the same. We kind of jump over to some live demo here. That's the first one that I have. So looking at, again, the code here, then that returns true, that returns false. We're actually going to execute that Java code, and you can see that the output is true and false from the execution of those things. So it's important to understand this whole equals operator structure when you're getting into Java, so that when you're comparing two things, and the place that trips you up the most is typically when you're doing string comparisons. And we'll talk about that as we get into some more of the examples. Again, variables that reference objects are compared by value, identical if their memory addresses are the same. So therefore, variables are identical if they refer to the exact same instance of the class. So again, that's going to return true. Equal objects, there is a dot equals. So therefore, if we go in and determine by implementation of the equals method, a lot of times you would say myDuck1 equals myDuck2, but it's not the same. It doesn't equal that because it doesn't return the same memory space or the same memory pointer. So let's run that one real quick. Okay. Execute that Java code again. So myDuck1 equals newDuck, myDuck2 equals myDuck1. Okay, that returns true. Okay, but if I go down and say myDuck1 equals myDuck2, again, that's going to return false when we do that comparison operator, because those are two separate objects completely. So when you see that code execute. Determined by implementation of the equals method, so object class and uses identity is usually overridden in certain sum classes. This is where you typically get into the most trouble, is you'll say string S is equal to, and you'll probably pull the string out of a field in a domino form or a document, and you'll say, is that string equal to, something inside of the double quotes. And even though it looks identical, as far as maybe the character is concerned, unless it's cased exactly the same, then that's always going to return false. And when I first started learning Java, this is one of the things that stumped me for hours and hours and hours until I really understood that we're actually comparing objects, not individual strings, although strings can be an object. So if we kind of look at that particular output, when we execute this code, you'll see that again, because hello world is not capital hello capital world. So when we say S equals M, that's going to return false. S equals M returns false. But notice that the string object, the string class, actually has a method called equal ignore case. When you're comparing strings, this is definitely going to be the method that you want to use. Is you want to say, take whatever this string value is, take this other string, completely ignoring case, and actually do a string literal comparison on it. So again, that should be one of those things that just saves you hopefully hours and hours and hours of kind of beating your head against the screen there. Null is actually used in Java to unassign objects from a variable or instantiate instances of a variable prior to actually being used. I can say string 1 is equal to 1, and then 1 is equal to null, which is basically set it to nothing, and then set it equal to something else. So it's not required that you do that in between setting a string value, but just kind of so you understand that null is actually out there and are very real type. Getting in and working with arrays, we do a lot of stuff with arrays, a lot of times because that's how the data is returned. One of the things that we work with specifically in Domino objects is vectors, simply because for example, the notes item class, if you have one or more objects stored, one or more values stored in a notes item field, that's actually stored in there as a vector, which is an array type structure in Java. So understanding how to work with arrays is extremely important. We get in and we instantiate instances by using the square brackets. So I can say data type, array of integers, is a new array basically. I can also say array of integers equals new int 5 and then pass in a particular value. I can also create and initialize arrays as a declaration. I can say, int array of integers. So you see that you can put the square brackets pretty much on the type or the variable reference. Doesn't really matter. The only other syntax that's a little bit bizarre is that if you're actually instantiating an array with values at the time that you create it, it's using the curly or French braces. Okay, so be aware of that. The first element of the array is always at index 0. So you want to make sure that you get in and pull that out. If you're not using any type of initializer in the array, you can also then populate that by going in and specifically referencing the elements of the array by index value. So if I say array of integers is a new one that has 3 elements, then I can go in and say 0, 1, and 2. So unlike a lot of other type of lists that are common and popular today, arrays can only store one data type. So when we get in and we take a look, for example, we're creating an array of integers, an array of strings, then it won't allow you to then go in and store any other type of value in there, especially if you're going to be working with typing the values, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. The array object itself actually has a length property where you can then go in and use the length property of the array to process it using any type of looping structure. You can use the for loop, for while, if you want to do conditional processing with inside the looping. The standard loop structure, for example, here is for int I equals I is less than 5, or I is less than the length of the array. System.println would produce this. If you're using JDK 1.5 or higher, there's a for each loop structure that just has some significantly simpler syntax. So given the same array of integers, I can say for int j colon array of integers, and then basically that becomes a temporary placeholder looping through every element of whatever the array is. And then inside the code block, then I can simply just go through and work through that. So, for example, here, when I execute this code, I get 1 through 5 and 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And again, we just create an instance of our array of integers. We populate those manually. Int array of integers 2, we populate that object at the time we create it. We use this for structure using array of integers.length. While I is less than the length of the array of the length of the first integer array, and then this one we use the new for each output to simply go in and get the value and process every element of the second integer array. So kind of seeing examples of those is helpful at that point. Conditional statements. I don't use this one a lot, honestly, but I prefer, and I guess it kind of makes me old school, is that I like the if else. Although I see this used pretty often enough that you should be aware of it anyway, is the x question y colon z. Basically, x has to be a Boolean, y and z can be of any type. Evaluates to y if x is true, otherwise evaluates to z. I always have to try to figure out what that's doing when I can have an if condition statement. They can be nested, so I can have if else. So I typically use these because for me they're just easier to read, but if you remember that logic, you can do this as well. We have switch statements just like in Lotusphere. Break allows you to stop after executing an expression. Those are out there and those are available. Again, if you don't, then all of the expressions get evaluated, so you want to make sure that you drop your breaks in there. Looping structures, additional looping structures, while and do while, same thing. I can say while, and that'll execute as long as that condition is true. I can say do, which means the code will always execute at least once, and then test at the end. That's a do while loop, very, very similar to Lotusphere. So we've gone in and we kind of looked at some of those Java fundamentals, and I did the demos as we were going through, so we're not going to stop there. So moving right along into kind of object-oriented. How do you define a class? Java classes are defined by using that class keyword. Class name follows the keyword, and by convention start with a capital letter. In Notes and Domino, we'll see that you can create a class inside of an agent. You can create a class using the Java library. You can get in and create a class using the new Java code element. But you want to follow those conventions that are defined. So if I'm going to create a class, animal, bird, duck, the uppercase letter or the proper case version of the first letter is just the standard convention. When you create a class, you want to make sure that you've defined how accessible it is. Generally, everything that you're going to do inside the Notes Domino space is you're going to create public classes. In other words, they're going to be used to instantiate objects and then be able to call the methods of those. And, you can further refine fields as well as methods within the class to be public or private. We'll talk about that. If you don't specify it, then only classes in the same package can reference those classes. So they're in essence private if you don't declare them public. Every time you create a Java source file, it is saved with a .java extension. Even inside of Domino Designer, if you don't really see it, it's actually abstracted from you, especially with agents, in that the .java files are stored in the agent context as well as the class context. One file can contain one public class. One file can contain more than one non-public class. So you typically have at least one public callable class, but then you can have n number of classes defined inside the Java file, or private classes that are then simply used. The construct of a class, typically you're going to put it inside of a package. The file name has to be the same name as the class name contained in the file itself. So if I have a file called duck.java, then I have to define public class duck. If I don't, then the compiler is actually going to complain. You're going to throw an error that says, this class name is not the same as the file name that's used. So you have to have those two synced up. I already talked to you a little bit about packages and why the package is important. Typically, if you write any Java code, it is a best practice to always use a package. You should never create any type of Java code that doesn't include a package. And of course, then there's exceptions to every rule. So the primary exception to that rule in coding in Notes Domino is that packages don't really add any additional value to Notes agents, Java agents inside Notes and Domino. So if you code Java agents, as a matter of fact, it's kind of a hassle to actually code agents with packages. So I would recommend that would be the only exception to the rule. But anytime you create any other type of Java code, if it's the new Java code element, or you're using Eclipse to write Java code, or you're developing any type of bean, then for XPages, then you definitely want to include this package. And the package is typically the reverse DNS name of whatever your organization is. Com acme code. It's just a folder structure to uniquely identify the classes within that directory, so that they can be distinguished from other classes that might have the exact same name. Again, it's typically the de facto standard is the reverse DNS of whatever your organization name. For example, we create code here at GBS, com.gbs.code or com.gbs.util, com.gbs.training, and those are where we put those particular class references. Referencing classes, so if you've defined classes or classes are defined for you, then you pull those in by the actual package reference. So I can say the full qualifier here, I can define this class duck that's in com acme code. If I want to use a class from another package, then I either have to fully identify it, com acme utils mod duck duck, mduck, and then say mduck is equal to a new instance of com acme utils, or I can simply create an import statement. and say, import all of the classes of ComAcmeUtils. And this is an extremely misleading statement from the standpoint that when you see this syntax, it appears as if, if that utils package has 92 classes, that you're importing all 92 classes and kind of bloating your code. And that's not really true. What you are saying is all 92 classes inside that package are basically available to your code stream. I'll also tell you that that's kind of this is really, really good for development, but it's not so good for production. One of the things that you should do prior to going into production is optimize your code, and that's a functionality that's built into Eclipse. I'll show you that, and when we get to it, Control-Shift-O will actually optimize your Java code, and it'll break out and make an individual import statement specifically for only the classes in that package that are used. And that's just simply going to make your code that much more efficient. But this is what we do for development. Is you'll see, for example, lotus.domino.asterisk for all of those, ComAcmeUtils, bring all those in, and then again, it's just going to make your development that much easier when you're working with those objects. So the class path and .jar files. Jar files or Java archive files are an opportunity to pull together several class files into basically one structure. A lot of times they don't all have to be inside the same package, but a lot of times they are. But we have this one jar file, and the jar, instead of deploying 12 class files to your class path, you can then simply deploy this one jar file. And then all of the classes within that jar can be referenced. And the jar file usually contains, again, the compiled class files, not the Java source files. So you, again, put those on your class path. A jar file, if you're not really sure how to open that, if you've got WinZip or 7-zip, it's basically a WinZip file. It's just an uncompressed, typically, archive file that you can get in and look at. Once you have your class defined, inside the class you then can define fields and properties. In Java they're really called fields, but in LotusScript terms you're used to referring to those as properties, so I'll probably use those interchangeably. So inside the duck class, then I can create two things. I say private string duck type, private int quack. Again, you have your access modifier, private public. You have your type, string, int, long, document, database, session, and whatever the type is going to be, because everything has to be typed, and then an identifier, so your field name. Identifiers are typically done in lowercase characters or camel case characters, as you see here. If I want to say duck type, then the only capitalized value would be the secondary word there. You can initialize fields when you instantiate a new instance of the class. If the class reference has fields identified in it or defined in it, then numeric primitives are always initialized to 0, 0.0. Booleans are initialized to false. Reference type fields are going to be initialized to null because they don't really point to anything yet. But fields can also be explicitly initialized when declared. So for example, if I have a duck class, I can say private duck type equals dabbling, and this is basically creates a default value for that particular string. So when I instantiate an instance of the duck class, if I don't actually call the method for setting the duck type, then by default all ducks are dabbling ducks. And dabbling is a real duck type. I know it's true because I looked it up on the internet. And yeah, that wouldn't lie to me. 4 different modifiers. You've got public, protected, default, and private. So 90% of the time what you want is public inside a class that you're actually working in. If you're going to go in and actually start creating classes to be, base classes to be called by other classes, then typically you want your identifiers to be private. It's definitely a best practice to always define your fields or properties as private and then use methods, getter setter methods, in order to go in and access the values of those particular fields or properties. So when we define those methods, again, they're going to have an access modifier, again, same as for fields, return type, method name, parameters. When you go in and you define a method, a lot of times you'll see the public void method name. Void simply means it doesn't return anything. It doesn't have to have a return statement. If it's going to actually have a data type, if it's public string, public int, public long, public document, then you actually have to return an instance of that particular data type. And we'll get in, we'll take a look at some of those as well. So, constructors. Again, we talked a little bit about constructors earlier. If not included, again, the default constructor is basically used from the object class. You can't overload to create these multiple signatures. So for example, if in my duck, I may or may want to instantiate a duck reference with or without passing the number of quacks to it. So again, the same name as the class, manipulate new instance. So these are two constructors for my duck class, one that takes a message and one that doesn't. And you can get in and define those so your classes, again, can have multiple signatures. Static fields are defined by public static or public final static. What that means is that there's only one copy of the field for the class. Static fields are also known as class variables. Java constants are declared static final fields. Modifier final indicates the field cannot be changed anywhere in the code. So a lot of times we'll use public static final to read in values from, for example, parameter files, so that they're used as constants throughout the entire code stream. You can also have static methods related to a class that are not individual instances, again defined by the static keyword. They're typically utilitarian in nature, and like when you create a wrapper class. So if you want to see a lot of those, you can actually kind of dive into the wrapper classes to see how those are actually called. Static methods can actually, methods and fields can actually be called without instantiating an instance of the class. They can actually just be called from the base class themselves. We then get in a little bit to inheritance and polymorphism, and we'll kind of look at an example of this. But you basically have two types of capabilities for implementing a base class or inheritance. You have extends and implements. With extends in Java, you can only extend one particular class. In other words, multiple inheritance is not going to be supported in Java. You wouldn't be able to say public class myDuck is equal to animal, extends animal, comma, mammal, comma, amphibian. You can only say extends one thing. So that's not a huge issue because we have implements. We'll talk about that. We actually have a real-life implementation of that when we get into the Nuts Domino objects here in just a little bit because that's exactly what happens between rich text item and item. If you look at the Nuts item class and the Nuts rich text item, you'll see that the rich text item actually inherits from item. So what that simply means is it doesn't have to redefine all of the fields and methods from the item. It simply inherits them. Okay? Again, and then we go through the generalization specialization loop there. So you can see real-life implements of that. For the most part, when you get into inheritance, in general, all subclasses inherit from superclass data and behavior. And we map those that the subclasses are going to inherit all of the fields as well as the methods, and we'll look at a concrete example of that. One thing about extending a class is that you can then get in and actually override the value. So the method is overridden. So if we have, for example, the animal class, the dog and cat, or dog and cat subclasses, you don't want your cats barking and your dogs meowing. So you can define a talk class or a talk method in the animal class, and then override that at the specific instance so that your animals speak correctly. As an alternative to base classes, then you can also define an interface, and an interface is really kind of mapping out an API saying the class that is going to implement this particular interface then really has to use all of the field values and methods that are defined inside that particular interface. Now the cool part about an interface is that you can say once you've defined an interface, you can then actually allow multiple interfaces to be used inside of a particular class. Okay? Interfaces are not magical from the syntax point of view. Instead of saying public class, you just say public interface animal, public interface mammal. When you define the interface, it can only have method signatures or final static fields. They can't contain anything other than final static fields or static methods, method implementation. It can't have any constructors. It uses the base constructor. It's also possible that one interface extends another interface. And this is really where we kind of get into, again, the hierarchical structure and nature of Java, where I can implement an interface that's an implementation of another interface. And then inside the class that uses the interface, I can call, or have access to all of the methods field definitions of those two interfaces. Okay? Inheritance works with the same as with classes. So I use the implements keyword. So if I say public class duck implements animal, unlike extends, if I use implements, I could say public class duck implements animal, comma mammal, comma amphibian, whatever. It allows me to actually use multiple instances of those particular things. So we have a kind of a pseudo example of that we're going to work with. That's bad. Well, that's not the example I wanted to show. Actually, it's the my duck example. All right. So in this particular case, we have the duck base class, and again, where we've got our private strings and our private int. So those are the defaults. We have two constructors. This.quack is equal to the quacks, and then notice that we have a series of what we call getter setters. Now, I'm going to plant some seeds here. Any of you that have heard about creating Java beans, this is a Java bean. Basically, the definitions and rules for creating a bean are private fields with public getter-setter methods to operate on the values of those fields. So we've created this, and then in my actual Java class called myDuck, then I can go in and I can say, duck is D1 is equal to a new duck. I can set the quacks equal to 5, and then say, get quack, plus a new line there. And then the duck type is equal to the get duck type. Notice that I didn't, call the set type method on the first duck instance. So it returned dabbling, okay, which was the default value. Now I go in and say, duck D2 is equal to a new duck, but this time I actually use the constructor where I pass in the quacks. So I don't have to call the set quack method, but I can call the set type method and say this is my favorite type of duck, which is Peking duck. And then I can again call the get quack and get type, and it's going to, without having to call the getter method on it, that's going to pull in the value that I passed in. I could override that by saying set quacks inside my code for whatever reason, or use that number to append it. And this time, because I actually called the set type Peking, then that's the value returned by get type. So public getters and setters, private fields, and then instantiate an instant using the proper constructor, for that particular instantiation type for that class type there. Okay. So popping back out. Last but not least, then, things to put on your roadmap to be aware of. There are, starting with Java 1.2 and higher, we do have collections. They're going to use the story tree to manipulate other Java objects. They're not like arrays. Collections don't store primitives. Collections can store different objects, and not all objects in a collection have to have the same Java type. So there's a lot of interest out there in these collections, array lists, which is a list of arrays, hash maps, hash sets, tree maps, vectors, and again, all instances of its item class return vectors. So just put these things on your radar to be aware of. Finally, let's talk about exception handling. Exception handling is going to be done through try-catch blocks, and it's automatically built into pretty much every code type that you go in and start creating. So you can put those in. Starting with Java 1.5, we also have the concept of generics. I talk about in the old days, and this is a direct quote from less than a year ago when I was teaching a Java class, and I said in the old days, and one of the students said, that was just before the glaciers melted and when you started writing Java code, right, Paul? Yeah, he didn't last long, sorry. But generics allow us to no longer have to use the actual casting. So prior to Java 1.5, I could create a new array list and I could add a document to it, but the array list would only take objects. So when I needed to read the value back out of that array list, I would have to specifically cast it as a document object. And we kind of have generics kind of save the day. I now can go in and create an array list or a vector or pretty much any of the collection types, and I can go ahead and I can type those at the point in time that I create the object. So I can say, you know, array list AL equals new array list, and then that would allow me to put only document objects in there. So, and what that's referred to really is type safety. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, though. One of the benefits of array lists was that I could drop any type of object into the array list. If I do this, if I actually code it with type safety, if I try to put anything in the array list other than a document object, then I'm actually going to get an error. But it does keep me from having to cast that, which is kind of cool. And then for exception handling, we have the try, catch, finally blocks. That's going to be try, catch. You can have multiple catch clauses. This is going to come into play in just a little bit when we get into our agent code. So try, catch, catch. We always go from highest order to lowest order. Most commonly used for cleaning up resources. If you're using APIs from different vendors, then you might want to catch exceptions for SQL exceptions, catch exceptions, for a specific type of class that you're instantiating, and then you should always end with just the common exception. We'll get in and take a look at that. So we've already looked at the Java object-oriented kind of fundamentals there with the duck class. So let's jump right into Domino Designer. Starting with 8.5, Domino Designer is built on top of the Eclipse platform. And the really cool thing about that is that using Eclipse as your designer client, then that allows us to then take advantage of some of the design tools that have been built into Eclipse and used in Eclipse for years and years. We have the new Eclipse Java editor, the Java perspective preferences, the ability to create non-NSF Java projects without having to have a separate instance of Eclipse. Use third-party packages like the ability to create Excel spreadsheets. We'll look at an example of that at the very end here today. But with all new things, there comes some growing pains. One of the things that I talk a lot about, and I've done several presentations on, and then David Leedy created a Notes of 9 session on it, and as well as Paul Withers had mentioned it in one of his blog entries. When you first start your Notes client with Domino Designer, regardless of how much memory you have on the system, there's basically a setting inside the JVM properties that are going to limit the amount of heap memory to 256 meg. Now, I'm working in a virtual machine, but even in that virtual machine, I've got 2.5 gig of RAM allocated to that. So, 256 is nothing. And a lot of times people talk about, Designer doesn't perform well. Designer doesn't, it's not intuitive. The Notes client doesn't perform well. So for both the Notes client as well as Domino Designer, you can actually control this. So in the Notes framework RCP deploy folder, there's this file called jvm.properties. Now this can also be done with Notes INI settings, but again, I kind of prefer to do it through the jvm.properties. This is simply a text file, and if you open up the text file, you'll see that the first two lines are XMX and XMS. The first one is the total heap size available. On a 2 gig system, I typically set that to 1/4 of the installed RAM. You don't want to typically set it to more than 1 gig of memory, or certainly you can't set it to more than 2 gig on an 8 gig system. I have seen people go in and try to set the second value. Now the second value, what that is the total heap at the beginning. So a lot of times people will set that to the exact same value, and that's a bad idea. You want to typically set that to a fourth of whatever your total is here at the top. And simply what that's going to allow you to do is say when you first start the system, that's the total amount of heap memory to start with, so that it doesn't have to grow. And again, the default for that is typically 48. So these are the settings that I use. I know a lot of people in the blogosphere have talked about Domino Designer crashing on them, not performing well, etc., etc. Since I've made these changes, my Domino Designer runs until I shut down the system. Very few crashes. Okay? And I'll probably just jinx myself. I'll probably have my designer crash while we're on the system today. Excuse me. And then, well, how do you know? How can you kind of track that? And well, in Domino Designer, if you come over and with Domino Designer open, if you've made those particular changes, then you can go into File and Preferences, go into General, and there's a checkbox there called Show Heap Status. And unfortunately, this has kind of been a bug since they introduced it in 8.5.2, in that even though it's checked, it's not really sticky. And that every time you start a new designer session, you have to go in and apply that and click OK. But if I do, you'll notice now in the lower left-hand corner that I've got my heap size 72 megabytes of a total 128 max 512 mark. So instead of starting out at 48 and having to grow to 72, I set it to 128, so it actually starts there. And that's why you're going to see the designer and the notes client start significantly peppier. And then you can also monitor if whatever you're doing, if you're compiling lots of XPages or doing whatever, then you can also see how close you're getting to that 512. Because obviously if you exceed the 512, then that's when bad things are going to happen. That's when your systems are going to start crashing. And so you can determine what it is you're doing that is keeping the or using up your resources and allocations. So we'll get back to the slides, but while I'm here, one of the things that actually does that is when I open Domino Designer for the day, it's not uncommon for me to come in and open several databases. So I'll go and I'll work on several applications and I'll open those up. And when I do that, and those applications are open, I'm going to switch perspectives here back over to my XPages perspective. But when I open those up, then notice that they changed from that little gray database indicator to either the database icon or the little waffle icon. Well, every time I double-click on an application in the application navigator, that opens up the file in the virtual file system. And when I open up that file in the virtual file system, that takes up resources. And I don't get those resources back until I shut down the designer client or until I close that virtual project. Now, the issue is if I right-click on the application, there's not any way to close the virtual project from the application navigator. But if I load the Package Explorer, then I can see all of the virtual project folders that are out there. And then I can simply go in and say, okay, well, these are the ones, if I right-click on them, then you'll notice that I've got a Close Project option. And if I close the projects that I'm not using, you'll see that they then turn into that gray database icon again. So that's going to give that memory back to the Domino Designer client, so when and if it is needed. So now those are actually closed. So if you get in the habit of when you open an application to close that application, then that's simply going to free up more memory and make that memory available to Domino Designer. So I typically try not to have any application other than the applications I'm currently actively working on open in my workspace. And I think what you'll find is that Designer just stays up and running a lot more often. It just stays running longer. So again, you can monitor that memory use that's there. in preferences too, one of the other things that you can do, this goes back to one of the hints that I gave you earlier, is to get into the habit of using Java instead of Lotusphere. If you go into your preferences and choose Domino Designer, at the very bottom of that preferences screen, you can change your script libraries, agents, web service providers, and consumers to default to Java code. And that means every time you go to create a new object of that type, it'll default to the Java language. So it kind of forces you to then go back and choose Lotusphere instead. So again, if you just do this one thing, it'll be a reminder every time you create an agent or a library or a web service component that you need to get in and start thinking about using Java instead. If you're going to be creating lots of Java agents, then another preference under Domino Designer Java Editor is to auto-save the Java design element on save of individual Java sources. Now, what that's going to do, it's kind of an irritation, is in writing Java code, specifically agents, if I was to open up a new agent and make any change here and then save it, what it would do, notice that there was an asterisk up at the top there, it would save my source code, but it wouldn't save the project. So I would save the source code, but then I would have to come back out and also save the agent itself. So I would, in effect, have to save twice in order to be able to test or execute the code. And it was always happening to me that I would be executing the agent code, I would save it here, go test it again, and it would give me the exact same results because I saved the source code, but I didn't actually save the project, which is the agent context. So turning on that particular property, autosave Java design, on save of individual Java sources will allow you to hit Control-S inside your Java source code without then having to Control-S again, which is, again, kind of nice. Some overall designer best practices for optimization. Again, close projects. Make sure that you're using working sets. Those are all good things. Java versions supported by Domino. Currently, 8.5 does support version 0.6. When you get in and you look at your preferences, so when you first install Java, if in Designer you can go into preferences for the entire workspace, and if you open those up and you go to your Java compiler, you'll see that by default it's set to a compliance level of 1.5. And this is going to make it compatible with any version of Domino 8 or 8.5 for that code executing on Domino servers 8 or 8.5x. Now, if you've completely upgraded to 8.5 and you want to take to advantages of some of the things in JDK 6, you can change. Excuse me. You can change your compliance level, and more importantly, you can change your compliance level for the source compatibility and the generated class file compatibility. You want to make sure that that's certainly set to a minimum of 1.5 for when you're executing that code, and that allows you to take advantage of the things that I mentioned, like generics, the new for each loop capability. But you can set that for your workspace, and then you can also set that on an individual project. So if you have an application that maybe is going to run on 8.5, but you don't want to change your entire workspace to 1.6, then you can certainly go into, again, the Java compiler there, and you can change the individual project properties and set the compliance level for that. And then that'll be that for that particular NSF and the deployment of that NSF. Okay. Design elements that support Java code are going to be agents, web service providers and clients, script libraries. In 8.5 only, we introduced the new Java code element. Applets, I will be real honest, I haven't done anything with applets in the past 10 years. We did some really, really cool things with applets in the late 90s, early 2000s. There's still some applet legacy code out there, but we really don't use it. And definitely the use of third-party libraries, and we're going to take advantage of that at the very end of the thing today. So getting in and working with Domino Designer 8X, again, that should help you make your designer experience significantly better when working overall, but then also working with Java. So let's jump in and talk specifically about Java Domino objects. So I'm going to make the assumption that most all of you are coming from the Lotusphere background. So if you go back even further, and I'll date myself, having worked with Notes and Domino since release 2, I started with the formula language. When they brought out Lotusphere, we're like, oh man, I mean, I don't know. This is like a real programming language, if you will. So we had to kind of shift the way that we did things. And we all did it. We have, if you printed it out, you've got the @formula code that would, take up 3 pages of printout. And we were able to reduce that to like, 12 lines of Lotusphere. And it did the exact same thing. It just did it better, faster, more efficient. So the same thing here is getting into a comfort level and understanding how you're going to transition that code from Lotusphere to Java. The things to understand about the differences is we only have access to the back-end objects. In other words, there's no UI components. We don't have any access to the equivalent Lotusphere UI workspace classes. We only have access to the back-end stuff. You, the Domino developer, you already know 98.67% of all the Java class names, because if you just drop notes from the Lotusphere name, you automatically have the Java class name. The only difference is, yes, they are case sensitive. Performance-wise, I get asked this question a lot, is agents versus Lotusphere agents. They call the same C++ code base. So on an apples-to-apples comparison, they're going to perform, pretty equitably. If we go back over to our code example, I actually have some Lotusphere code, and this is going to open up the designer help database, and it's just going to loop through those particular documents. And if I run this from designer, then it's wicked fast. I mean, it processed 9,000 documents in 0 seconds. So 0 full seconds. I'm sure it took a couple nanoseconds. So if I go in and I do this via the same Java, I run that. Done, and then choose my Java output. You'll see that basically I've got the exact same thing. Okay, 0 seconds processing 9,357 documents. On an apples-to-apples basis is exactly the same. Now what you have to be careful about is I'm going to run this agent called help slow.count. I'm going to run it. Click done. And notice that took actually 3 times as long. And this is really part of the problem with Lotusphere developers transitioning over to Java development. So let's go and take a look at some of the reasons why for that. Okay, in working with objects in Lotusphere, one of the things that you never really had to worry about was quote-unquote recycling your object. And so in Lotusphere, we would just say, doc equals, get next document, and doc. And what would then happen is it would replace that in memory, and it was pretty efficient. It's not too grossly inefficient. If we utilize that exact same code in Java, then if I was to say doc was equal to view get next document doc, we would actually support something called shadowing, which means that it would go in and I would have at the end of the get next document statement, I would actually have 2 documents in memory. And then in this case, where I was processing 9,000 documents as that agent was running, then by the time the agent's done, I have 9,000 documents in memory. And depending upon the size of those documents, that could take up a whole bunch of memory. So you want to make sure that you've utilized this construct. So anytime you're looping through objects, and it's not limited to documents, but definitely using documents as the primary example that we have. In that when you say get next document, what you want to do is actually instantiate two document objects. And then while doc is not equal to null, you can say inDoc is equal to get next document doc. So notice inDoc, doc. Call recycle against the doc object, and then going back to what we, kind of going full circle, doc is equal to inDoc because they're instantiated instances of the same class type. If you do this, then you're not ever going to have more than two documents in memory at any given point in time. Now, the question I then get asked the most often is, well, Paul, why aren't you recycling inDoc? Because when I say doc is equal to inDoc, there's no longer any references to inDoc, which means it is automatically garbage collected. So I don't have to call recycle against it. But if you're iterating over any type of object, whether it's items, whether it's documents, whether it's databases, whether it's views, then you want to call, all the Domino objects have that recycle object against them. Okay? You don't want to over recycle. You want to be really, really careful about doing things like recycling your session. That's bad. But definitely call it against documents. If you do that one thing, then you're going to find that your Lotus script code is going to perform as efficiently, or your Java code is going to perform as efficient as your Lotus script code. Again, I like to point this out. Primary problems is you have compilers. Java, again, is case sensitive. It's always going to be case sensitive. You have data type errors because, again, there's no variant. And the most common runtime errors you're going to get are null pointer exceptions or class not found exceptions. And we'll talk about some of those there. Specifically, if you're going to be working with Java agents, you don't have any access to the Notes UI. So you'll notice in the two different demonstrations that I ran, when we're troubleshooting Lotus script stuff, a lot of time when we run those agents, we would throw up a very simple message box. It was really easy to get the output into a message box and see what was happening there. Unfortunately, we don't really have that same capability. Although we do have access to the swing classes, I'm not going to recommend that you use those. So you'll notice that when I ran this particular code, that my output was actually put in what we call the Java Debug Console. And you access that by choosing Tools, Show Java Debug Console. Now, the Java Debug Console is the equivalent whenever you do a system out, that's where it's going to go. And so that becomes one of our primary debugging tools specifically with agents. So you can clear that. Be careful with it because it's cumulative. Every time you run code, it's going to write to the console, but it's not going to clear the existing contents first. You want to make sure you're not troubleshooting an error that you've already fixed. So getting access to the Java console will allow you to see that output. And that's how I've architected a lot of the different solutions here. Agent base, when you create a new agent, Java agents must extend agent base. And you don't really have to worry about this too much because when you create a new agent, this will be my way cool new agent, notice that it defaults to Java because I set that in my preferences, and then I click OK. It's going to basically open the agent interface. It's going to create Java agent source file.java. And it automatically creates this shell for you. So it automatically extends agent base. That's not something that you have to commit to memory. Every time you do create a new agent, that's what's going to happen. So this becomes the shell. It automatically then also creates the session and the agent context, and it puts this little helper in the middle. Your code goes here. And literally, your code goes there. That's where you're going to go in and put in your content. Now, one of the issues that I find that happens the most often, we talked about try-catch blocks. And if you go in and you create a new agent, as you just saw me do, then it puts in the catch exception. And this is the generic Java exception. In other words, there's no difference between catching a Notes exception and catching a Java plain old ordinary exception. So I tend to go in and put this catch Notes exception NE print stack trace into every agent that I create, and that gets a little bit cumbersome. The problem is that there's no way to change that default code. There's no way to go in the underlying structure and say when I create a new agent, then put that in. But because the 853 Designer is built on top of Eclipse, then I can absolutely take advantage of the Eclipse design capability, one of which is these really, really cool things called snippets. And snippets are simply code blocks that I can store and then recall at any time that I want. So if I'm going to use a particular set of code, it doesn't have to be a complete code block. It can just be a snippet. Then I can open up my snippets view, and then I can simply call that. There's a resource I actually put together, some Java Agent Starter snippets, and those are actually downloadable from my old website, and I'll talk to you all about that when we get there. Okay, so a couple things. You don't have to download the ones that I created. You can actually come in and I can say, I want to take this code, whatever it is, and I want to actually add that to snippets. Now when I do that for the first time, it'll actually prompt me for a new category. I've already got my snippets category. If I click OK, I can say this is a better agent template. And I can go in and I can modify this any way that I want. And then when I click OK, then a better agent template is now part of my snippet code. And I can actually right-click on any of those things, and I can go to Customize, and that'll open up the editor that'll allow me to actually change the snippet code if need be. So what I typically do is every time I create a new agent, I just highlight the entire thing and wipe it out, and double-click on let's see, Java code shell. Oh, no, it's not the one I wanted. Java demo template. There we go. My agent template. Insert. And that automatically has my notes exception built into it. So it's identical to the other one, although I don't have to remember to drop that additional catch block in every time. But I can also put in really, really cool things. I can drop in particular comments. And I can store those off, and so that I don't have to re-comment my code every time. It makes comments easier. And again, you just store those off into your snippet registry. And the other great thing about my snippets is when you create these snippets, you can actually export them out. If I go to my settings, okay, that's just the format that I use. If I go to Customize, okay, my snippets, then I can actually export those out as an XML file, and I can give them to other developers, and then they could simply then say import that file and import those as an XML file. So you can actually kind of create a snippet repository somewhere, and then everyone going in and making sure that they've got the latest, greatest kind of best practices snippet code. And it just makes you a faster, easier, quicker developer. Close that one without saving. So some of the things that are out here that I've provided for you as examples is if you can just kind of walk the different context. So looking at agent context, it'll show you how you can then call methods of each of these things. The reality is once you get past agent context, in other words, you've got your session and agent context, pretty much everything past that is exactly like Lotusphere. You just create instances of the classes, and then you operate on them. So the code that's out here, you can simply right-click and run any of this code, and its output is going to go to the Java debug console. And then you can see that output there. You can see exactly what the output of that is. So I've given you code examples, and we're not going to go through very much of it, but for agent context, here's session. You can run the code and get information about your session, just like you did. Again, same functionality with the Lotus backend classes. So database, document, the different create, view methods, those are all there and available to you. One of the things that I will point out, and this one is alluding to one of the things that I talked about earlier, is the networking capability. Is if you go in and take a look, I've created this for you. You can actually create agents or Java code that are then going to kind of ping resources. In this particular case, then we're going and getting a particular value so that we're basically reading a web page. So we go in, server lookup, get the addresses there, output names to HTML. We actually encode that. So we have a string URL value. We print out that URL value, URL site equals a new URL. And then I create an HTTP URL connection. And again, remember that the networking is built into Java. So this can be the shell where it's actually going to like spider that particular website. So if I right-click and run this, then go to my Java console. I know that may be a little bit hard to read, but basically I'm reading all of my HTTP headers. I'm getting all my header content, okay? And again, I'm just going to this particular website. And then I actually read down through the entire HTML. So I have the capability to have agents that spider websites, read that stuff, pull that stuff in. I also have the capability to produce XML and HTML output. So therefore, I can have agents that if you have Lotusphere that does that, then obviously you can do the same thing with Java. So this is an example where it's taken the people view and it's creating an HTML document. We do that with the println. I can do the same thing by producing XML output from a Java agent. And again, going through and creating a well-formed XML document from kind of that perspective. And if I look at, pull up Google Chrome, I have a couple of these. So that's kind of cool. There's my names.xml. There's my names.html. And again, we're just running those agents. Those agents are producing the XML as well as the HTML output. So giving you working examples of all these, and again, you can download this application after the session's over today. Okay. Creating web service providers, I've included this information that a lot of people are getting in and taking a look at the opportunities, if you will, for web service consumers and web service providers. And a lot of times they do that in Lotusphere. And one of the reasons that I recommend that they look at the alternative of using Java is simply that underlying it actually uses the Apache web services architecture under the covers, underneath. So if you're using Lotusphere, there's actually some translation going on. So I would highly recommend that if you're doing any type of web service provider or web service client, that you look at alternatively using Java instead. Inside the sample database, we're going to kind of just, if you've not done anything with web services, then certainly nothing to be afraid of here. I've taken you down through the basics of creating web service providers and then also web service consumers. Then, and again, I can kind of let y'all read through this and I'll jump to the example. This is kind of the shell of what a web service provider looks like. And if for no other reason, creating web service providers allow you to expose data in existing Domino databases, but also directory information if the Domino directory is actually used as your primary directory, then you can expose that as web services to other systems. And that provides a lot more visibility for Domino in the Domino space. But it's a way to get data out without necessarily having the person on the other side having a Domino server or a Nodes client. But it may be a CRM system, a relational database system. Anything that has the capability to call web services. So this is just a really simple Java web service that's going to go to the name and address book, and given a particular name, it's then going to either return no name found. It's either going to get the internet address of the name, or if it finds the name but there is no email address, then it's going to say that particular email address is blank. Having a web service provider, then obviously you're going to use some kind of web service consumer. So you can actually self-consume. That doesn't sound good, but you can self-consume inside of Nodes and Domino. One thing to simply be aware of is when you're doing this, you can point to the WSDL of the existing web service, but when you pull that in, one of the things that you're going to want to know is not only can you change the service endpoint, but on the server itself, you don't have to worry about the Domino server doing that. But if you're actually consuming Domino web services from Domino, then you want to make sure you've gone into the server document and say run web agents and web services concurrently is enabled. If not, then it's very possible to get into a race condition where basically the web service is waiting for the web service client to complete, and the web service client is waiting for the web service producer to complete, and yeah, it never completes. It just locks up your server. Okay? So you can then create web service consumers in Java agents and then simply get in and call the methods of those. So inside the service locator class is actually the syntax for that. So going in and taking a look, you can pull that in. Java agents can consume the same complex web services that any Lotusphere can. They can consume web services from forms or, for example, a web query save agent. Okay? So you can handle do error handling in the Java web service agents. Simple web service tub. Simply get Domino stub email address. Do your try-catch block. Try-catch find with structures there. You can pass credentials in if you need to authenticate. Then you can simply go into the web service consumer and say, use the get credentials method of the instantiated class and also use the set credentials. You can change the service endpoint if you're moving from test or QA UAT to production without rebuilding the web service at all. So out in the demo database that I provided, then you've got inside your code, which you can't see right now. So let me open the Domino Designer perspective. Reopen that application. So I have a web service provider, and the web service provider is the WS demo, and I've kind of expanded that. So that's that sample code that we looked at. Okay, that's my web service provider. I took that WSDL, and you're able to look at the WSDL by just previewing that in a browser, and then you can actually say Domino WSDL, and that's the WSDL that you need when you go to create your web service consumer. So if I was going to create a new web service consumer, I could say this is the URL that points to the WSDL. Paste that in directly, which is exactly what I did, which is what produced the consumer demo 1 code. And in there, that's going to create these 4 files. If you've ever created an Apache web service, then you're going to find that this is very, very similar to that. Inside the actual service Java file, if I expand this, this is where you can go in and get the stub reference of how you call that in an agent. So you don't ever actually necessarily modify any of the code in the web service consumer. What you do is then create an agent that's going to test that. So I could go in and say in this particular web service client, I can import that consumer library, open it up, and then I'm just going to pass a name directly to it for testing purposes. If I execute this and then pop over to, and I keep closing, show Java debug console, then you'll see that I get Mary Smith, which is my output. But I can also wire that to the web query save event in an agent. So I can pull that same thing into a Java agent that is actually going to pass that into the web, using the web query save event. So I can get the service locator, I can look up the lookup name from the form, which I'm getting from my document context, stub, call to get an email address, and then return the email address. So I have a form that does that in the demo database here, so you've got a full working example of that web query save capability. So if I open that up and I put it in a name that doesn't exist, for example, Paul, I get no name found, which is what is returned. I put in Mary, and I run that, then it returns the internet address from Mary's name and address book. document in the name and address book. So the cool part is this kind of is a, a self-fulfilling web service, if you will, self-consuming web service. But that's a web service that can be consumed by any place outside of Notes and Domino. And there's a huge amount of power to that, and you're going to find that your Java web services are typically going to perform better than the equivalent Lotusphere web services because it's not having to go through kind of that abstraction layer. All right, last but not least, let's get in and talk about the Java and XPages. And again, we've kind of saved this till the end. There's a lot of references that are out there. This is not really specifically meant for Java and XPages, but you can do a lot of really, really cool things with Java and XPages. So let me go ahead and say that starting out, especially over the past 12 months, I've read lots of things in blogs and at sessions that there's the misnomer that if you're not a Java guru, then you can't develop XPages. And let me just go ahead and state that that is categorically untrue. You can create some really rock-solid, wicked cool, rockstar style applications that are based upon XPages and never write a single line of Java. Now, with that said, the more you know about Java, because XPages is a Java architecture, again, the just better developer you're going to be. So is it a requirement? Absolutely not. Is it something you probably want to add to your toolkit? Absolutely yes. So simply be aware that when we get into the XPages, you don't code specifically in Java, but you can certainly create Java code elements, Java beans. You find that you're going to write the majority of your code in server-side JavaScript. Okay, so the following code creates a variable using the JavaLang string class. And again, this isn't a specific example that you would use all the time, but to just kind of show you how you can do this, this is a button that has an on-click event executing server-side code. And I can get the first and last name components from the actual XPage itself, and using the JavaLang string class, I can actually then go and call the toUpperCase method. Now, obviously, server-side script and JavaScript has an uppercase method that I can instantiate, but this shows you the exact way you would instantiate any Java object inside of SSJS. So you can call Java code from SSJS, which then allows you to take advantage of any of the core JDK, but it also then allows you to take advantage of third-party Java libraries in XPages. So because Java's been around a long time, there's some really, really cool stuff that's out there, and a lot of it is really open source. One of the things that we came across in a project is that when we were taking existing Notes applications to XPages, I would say 6 out of 10 of them had this capability that they needed to be able to export Excel spreadsheets. And even though all of these applications came from the same company, what we found was that nobody had implemented the export of this the same. Some use Lotusscript, some use COM, some use just the XML version. So what we needed was a way that we could duplicate, because we wanted to be able to have that same functionality in the XPages. So what we decided on was going out to the Apache library and get the Apache POI. So the Java library POI from Apache Foundation, again, which I say from which all good open source tools come, that and OpenNTF, allows for creating these Office documents. So what we did is we downloaded the POI.jar file. We dropped the POI.jar file inside of we unzipped it and we got the POI.jar file. The current version is 3.7. That's the only file you need for development and deployment. Access the POI library can be done 2 ways. You can add it directly to every application, which is not the best practice, or you can add it to the best, or the Domino server, which is the best practice, because then you only have to upgrade in one place. Regardless of the choice, it's written the same way. On the Domino server in my designer client, I can open up the XSP folder and I can just put the jar file there, so I've got my relational database driver there for that and the POI one. You can also put it inside of web content, web INF. You can create a lib folder, and then you can drop the jar file directly inside that lib folder. If it already exists, then you can just drop it in there. For my sample database, then that's exactly what I've done, is window, open perspective XPages, my package explorer, web content, web INF, navigator, web INF. No, that's not the right application. Why wasn't there? So this application that I just opened, which is the Apache Poi, again, that's also an application that's available for on the download site. Web content, web INF, web. Okay. So there you see the Poi 3.8, Poi Scratchpad. So those are both out there and available to you. So what that simply allows us to then do is, with those jar files deployed, we found three primary use cases, is being able to export all documents, selected documents, and then a collection of documents from a query. So we're just going to run through each of those use cases. The way that we implemented this was actually using what's called an XAgent. If you're not familiar with XPage development and XAgents, there's nothing magical. XAgents are simply XPages that we've turned off the rendering property so that all of the output basically has to be coded by the developer. So it is very similar to writing, an agent or a servlet from that standpoint. In the before render response of the XAgent, we go in and we import the packages that we need, very similar. So even though this is server-side JavaScript, we're making calls to all of these Java packages. So we go out and we get, the view name, we pull in the list, in the before render response. So again, import all the packages, we create variables for the view to be processed, the field list that we pass in, the sheet name, we create the sheet name and workbook name, notes document and notes doc. We use classes from the Poi API to create a new workbook, create a sheet. We have a little creation helper for dates. We create a style for the output, and then in a for loop for the field list length, we then go in and create a row for every document, as well as every document in the view, and then basically every field that we're processing from the document we put into row values. We create the label, column, and headers for the column fields, and then we process every document in the view to create a row of output. To account for and process document data using the correct data type, that's why we have to go in and actually get the items themselves. So, and then test the item type so that when we actually write it to the spreadsheet, we're not just working with strings, but we're working with strings as well as numbers as well as dates. We create a variable for the file name. We use the faces context, the JSF API, to get the page response object in the output stream. And then that's where we actually write the output stream. Set the content type to MS Excel, set the header, that's where the file name is equal to the file name that we input, write the page output, and then we flush and close our stream. And then we say that the response is complete. And so there were lots of examples out there that kind of sort of accomplished this, but didn't really give us the complete capability that we wanted. So being able to marry these two things together was especially nice. So inside the XPages, this is where you're going to see our XAgents. And so if you go in and look at, for example, the main view sample, which is an XPage, and export view to Excel, and the on-click event of that particular button, then you'll see that we have our session scope, the view name, the list that we're going to process, and then you see that we use the JSF context redirect to page to call the stream Excel XSP, and the stream Excel XSP is the code that we just looked at. That's our XAgent. That's an XAgent whose render property has been set to false, and then in the before render response event of the actual XPage is where we put in all that data. So that would allow us to do something that looks similar to, if not exactly like the following. We can go in and say the export Excel main view. And so I can take this and say export view to Excel. And then open that up. And then boom, Shazam like magic. Okay, it exported every field and all the content from the entire view. And then the other two solutions are simply variations of that. Is if I can, export the entire thing, then I can also go in. That's not really what I meant to do. Let's try this again. So I can then go in and choose the create an interface where the first column has checkboxes, and so I can say export selected documents to Excel, and then I only get the output of the selected documents. What was that? And then last but not least, then I can also have the ability to go in and create an export based upon a query. So I can go in and choose my sample data form. So I wrote this interface that's included in the database, which allows me to say I want to choose the column labels of the data that I want to output. I want to put in a file name. I want to put in a sheet name. And then I want to put in a particular query. So the only thing I'm interested in here are the contacts from the state of Texas. I can also change the default column width here, and then I can create that report. Open that up. You'll see that the only thing that I get are the folks from the state of Texas, based upon that kind of full text query from the output. So that gives you an example of, and again, the details are here of kind of walking through each one of those things, plus you have the sample database at your disposal, ad hoc reporting, and the setup form and the way that we've architected that. Again, you'll have access to those download sites. So hopefully what this has done is given you a flavor of the things that you can do with Java in Notes and Domino, from simple agents all the way up through XPages and doing something as quote-unquote complex as exporting data to an Excel spreadsheet. So let me just pop back over real quick. If you want to download the sample files, you can go to my old website, www.nnsu.com. The snippet download is available from the Eclipse Rad 7 snippets, but if you simply go to Downloads, Lotusphere 2012, okay, then you can download the slides as well as the Apache POI and the Jumpstart NSF, which will give you all of the sample code that's there and out there. So again, that's just www.nnsu.com. If you went to Lotusphere or you didn't go to Lotusphere and you're seeing some of the slides that are out there, these are some of the other sessions that were available at Lotusphere, and just excellent, excellent content. If you were only going to download and access one, if you only had time for one, excuse me, I would tell you that this one, Write Better Java Code, Debugging, Logging, and Unit Tests with Mark Meyer and Julie Robichaud, that's just like I would say kind of like a must-read, if you will. Some other references and resources that are out there, there's the nnsu.com where you can download the sample applications as well as the Eclipse plugin. TLCC offers training for Java for Notes Domino developers. make a note that we are currently working, TLCC is going to deliver at the end of March. They're actually coming out with their first Java 4 XPage developers. That's a course that's not quite ready yet, but should come to market at the end of March. So you can kind of start looking for that. O'Reilly Publishing had first series, Java Sun Developer Network, the Eclipse project, those are all out there. The Apache projects, that's where you can get the POI applications. DeveloperWorks has an entire site devoted to just Java. Hundreds of thousands of lines of Java code examples that are out there. Really kind of a cool resource. Okay, so be aware of that. And this is my email address. Questions. I noticed that we had some questions that were posted out in the system. So let me see if I can just kind of start at the top. Going down through some of these. Aiden asked a question, is there any difference between saying string 1 is equal to 1 and then string 1 is equal to new string 1? The difference is you actually have to instantiate the second code there, string 1 is equal to new string 1, would be the proper syntax for that. Aiden also asked, JavaScript has the equals as a comparison, which is apparently a better guarantee of equality. The triple equals does not exist in Java, so we only have the equals parameter. In JavaScript, equals is actually object comparison, content comparison versus object comparison. Let's see, string is an object in Java, not primitive. There's always an object in both. Well, in the string 1, yeah, that should work. Also, although I always use the new keyword. Array example makes better sense. Int array, yeah. Okay. Array length are 0 based, not 1 based. Talked about that. You don't want to have the same values for the INI parameters XMX and XMS, because if you set both XMX and XMS to, like, say 1024, then there's just no room for it to grow and shrink, and it really wants to grow and shrink. I've had several people that have set XMX and XMS parameters in the jvm.properties file to the same value, and they found it to be extremely unstable. So just knowing how the heap works and how the underlying Java garbage collection works, I would not recommend setting those two things to the same thing. What about the Notes Client UI APIs? Those are there and available, but they're primarily available for working inside of the, completely lost the name. What do we call those things? Because we don't really actually code in them. File preferences, composite applications. Thank you very much. There they are. So for composite applications, is where we get the Notes UI stuff. For the Notes Client UI APIs for views and composite applications. And I'll just be real honest that other than proof of concept, I've never actually put any composite applications into production. So therefore, they are there, they are available, but again, unless you're coding with composite applications or doing something with a mashup editor, then it's not really an API that we spend very much time with. I have made the demo and the presentation available to you, so that's out there on the NNSU site. That is, really. You're welcome. The question, how do you modify the memory heap associated with the designer, from Richard? That's actually using the jvm.properties, so it's in the slides. So that's there. Showed you how to export Domino data. The question is, can you export it to an existing Excel document? And the answer is yes, as long as that Excel document is on the server, because it's running in from the XPages demonstration. That's obviously running in the server context. So if you actually have an existing shell of an Excel spreadsheet, for example, a spreadsheet that already has a bunch of macro definitions in it, you can actually use that as the basis, and yeah, you just point to that as the file. But you can use the Apache POI and just know it's client development. So if you're using this client development, they can obviously use a spreadsheet that's stored directly on their system. Okay. Is Java better compared to Lotus script keeping in view? Java can be called from Lotus script, not the vice versa. Okay, so I think what Pravella is talking about is using LS to J. I will tell you that I'm just not a big proponent of LS to J. You can call Java classes from Lotus script, but the only time that I've ever actually done that is when I actually had to use some kind of other Lotus script context that was not available to me in Java. For example, if I was using some kind of proprietary COM object. So outside of that, then it's just better to rewrite all that in Java. Okay. How's it best to use Java in original Lotus Notes outside of XPages? Yes, agents, web services, and libraries. And you've got examples of all of those in the sample database. So can you write composite applications using Java? Absolutely, if you can find some place to run composite applications. Again, as I just mentioned, the composite applications have been around. I ask this question at every city I present in. You know, how many people have, you know, there's lots of people that have kicked the tires on composite applications. I don't know of anybody that actually has put composite applications into production. So absolutely Java is one of the predominant languages for composite applications. I don't know of anybody that's doing it in production basis. So I think that takes care of all of the questions that are out there. If you have questions after the session, again, please feel free to drop me an email. My email address is still right there.
And that concludes this edition of Group Talk. Thanks for watching. To engage in conversations with us, visit twitter.com/gbsknows. To stay up to date, like us on Facebook at facebook.com/joingbs. And to watch entertaining and informative videos, visit youtube.com/gbsknows. And don't forget, visit our website and send us an email at gbs.com and info@gbs.com. Thanks again.